This is Heliox, where evidence meets empathy. Independent, moderated, timely, deep, gentle, clinical, global, and community conversations about things that matter. Breathe easy, we go deep and lightly surface the big ideas. Picture this. You're deep in the remote Caribou Mountains of Western Canada.
Right.
And you are standing in an old-growth forest. And it is the kind of quiet that feels, physically heavy, like it's insulated by millions of pine needles and these thick layers of damp moss.
Yeah, the really specific smell too, right? Like wet earth and decaying cedar.
Exactly, that exact smell. But then suddenly that quiet completely shatters because a young scientist named Suzanne Simard is literally running for her life.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she is tearing through the thick underbrush, scrambling over these massive slippery logs. And in each of her hands, she's gripping a syringe filled with volatile radioactive isotopes.
Which is just, an insane visual.
Right. And behind her, crashing through the brush with terrifying speed, is a massive, highly territorial grizzly bear.
It genuinely sounds like a sequence written for a summer blockbuster,
It really does.
But for a field ecologist who is just trying to map an entirely unseen world beneath our feet, that was just like a random Tuesday in the wilderness.
Just another day at the office.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, that image, sprinting through the woods, clutching delicate scientific instruments, while a massive force of nature threatens to completely obliterate you, it serves as a fairly perfect metaphor for her entire professional trajectory.
It really does, because she has spent decades racing against the clock to uncover the deepest mechanics of the forest ecosystem.
Okay.
And she's done it while navigating immense dangers.
Right, the physical dangers of the wild, obviously.
Yeah, but she also had to navigate the equally vicious, highly territorial dangers of the academic establishment. So welcome to this deep dive into the source material.
Glad to be here.
Today, we have a very tall stack of documents on the table. We're looking at peer-reviewed academic rebuttals recently published in Frontiers in Forests and Global Change. We've got investigative environmental reports from The Guardian and Atmos magazine.
And our central focus today is Suzanne Simard's brand new 2026 book, When the Forest Breathes.
Yes, exactly. Our mission today is to trace the journey of a scientist whose ideas completely inverted the global understanding of forestry.
Which is no small feat.
Not at all. We are going to explore the mechanics of her discoveries, the severe backlash from her scientific peers, and the intensely personal tragedies that reframed her understanding of nature.
It's a narrative that really forces us to question the fundamental assumptions we make about biology. If you're familiar with environmental science or ecology, you undoubtedly know her name.
For sure.
But our goal today is to go far beyond the headlines. We need to look at the exact methodologies she used, the statistical arguments leveled against her, and the massive landscape-scale problem of how we actually regenerate the natural world in an era of, rapidly accelerating climate disruption.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to set the baseline for how radical this shift was, we have to look back. For over a century, the traditional Western view of a forest was essentially modeled after a gladiatorial arena.
A gladiator pit.
Yeah. The prevailing wisdom was that a forest is just a collection of solitary individuals locked in a brutal zero-sum competition for finite resources.
Right, survival of the fittest in its purest form.
Exactly. They are fighting for every photon of sunlight, every drop of water, every ounce of soil nitrogen. It was just constant biological warfare. But Simard's research suggested a completely different model. To use a modern analogy, she argued the forest isn't a gladiator pit at all. It is much more like an automated high-frequency stock exchange.
That is a really apt way to visualize it, actually.
Right, because you have individual traders, the trees, but they are constantly exchanging assets. Sugars, carbon, and minerals are being traded back and forth at fluctuating exchange rates based on seasonal supply and demand.
Yeah, and this entire market is mediated by an underground network of fungal brokers, which is just wild to think about.
It's incredible, and it's overseen by older, heavily capitalized trees that actively manage the market volatility.
The transition from viewing the forest as this collection of isolated competitors to viewing it as a complex adaptive system is, it's easily one of the most consequential ecological revelations of our lifetime.
It's one of the most fiercely debated, too.
Oh, absolutely. And to understand how we arrived at this concept of a biological stock market, we have to look at the historical context. We really need to look at the specific problems Simard was hired to solve.
Right, because she wasn't raised in some sterile, temperature-controlled laboratory at an Ivy League university.
No, not at all.
She grew up in the Monashee Mountains of British Columbia, born into a multi-generational family of loggers.
But her grandfathers and her uncles, they practiced a very specific, almost archaic form of logging.
Yeah, they used horses, right?
Yeah, they used horses to haul the timber out of the woods. It was a highly selective process. They paid microscopic attention to the natural cycles.
Like the snow melt and stuff?
Exactly, the snowmelt, the river flows. They extracted timber, yes, but they deliberately left the structural architecture of the forest intact so it could regenerate on its own.
So it was essentially an intuitive stewardship model. It relied on generational observation.
Right. But when Simard actually entered the commercial logging industry as a professional forester in the 1980s, and she was frequently the only woman on the payroll, by the way, she collided with a totally different ideology.
The industry had completely pivoted.
Completely. They moved to an industrial agricultural model.
This is the era of what they chillingly called the normal forest, which, I mean, that sounds incredibly dystopian.
It really does.
Yeah.
It is basically a euphemism for a biological desert.
Wow.
Yeah. The standard operating procedure in the 80s and 90s was maximum efficiency extraction. You move heavy machinery in and clear-cut massive swaths of diverse, multi-species old-growth forest. You scrape the topsoil bare.
And then they brought in the helicopters?
Right. Helicopters would fly over and spray heavy chemical herbicides, most notably glyphosate, to chemically burn away any native broadleaf plants.
Because they viewed them as weeds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The industry viewed native species like paper birch or aspen as parasitic weeds. So once the ground was totally sterilized, they would plant a monoculture. Millions of identical seedlings of a single, highly profitable, fast-growing species.
Which was typically Douglas fir.
Yep, Douglas fir.
And I mean, the logic makes total sense from a spreadsheet perspective.
If you're only looking at the math, sure.
Yeah, it is purely agricultural reductionism.
Yeah.
You eliminate every single competitor. You funnel 100% of the ambient light and soil moisture directly to your cash crop, and you maximize the yield per acre for your shareholders.
And that was the accepted science at the time. But when Simard was actually out in the field walking these massive, chemically sanitized plantations, she noticed a glaring anomaly.
The sickly seedlings.
Yes. The logging conglomerates were spending millions of dollars on herbicides to eradicate the birch and aspen just to pamper these newly planted Douglas firs. And yet, in many of these clear cuts, up to 10% of these isolated, pampered fir seedlings were turning yellow.
10% is a lot when you're planting millions of trees.
It's a massive loss. They were becoming highly susceptible to frost and disease and dying.
I am looking at this from a pure cost-benefit analysis, and it seems entirely counterintuitive.
How so?
Well, in a strict Darwinian model, if I have a plot of dirt and I kill all the other plants, the one remaining plant has zero competition. It should absolutely thrive.
Right, that's the theory.
So why on earth are these trees getting sick when they have a monopoly on the resources?
And that anomaly exposed the absolute limitation of looking at biology solely through the lens of competition.
So what does she do?
Well, Simard developed a hypothesis that flew in the face of her employers. She suspected that the broadleaf trees, the birch and the aspen that were being poisoned because they cast shade over the firs, were not strictly competitors.
Even though they were physically blocking the sun.
Right. She theorized that beneath the soil, completely out of human sight, these different species were intricately connected. Yeah. By eradicating the so-called weeds, the logging companies were inadvertently destroying the life support system of the very cash crop they were trying to cultivate.
So she sets out to prove this hidden connection. And to do it, she designs this incredibly elegant, physically demanding experiment for her doctoral thesis.
This is where the Geiger counters come in.
Yes. She decides to use radioactive isotopes to trace the invisible movement of food. She goes out into the wild forest and she literally places large plastic bags over the branches of two different species of trees growing near each other.
A paper birch and a Douglas fir.
Exactly, and the logistics of this are fascinating. Why use the bags?
She uses plastic bags to temporarily seal the atmospheric environment around the leaves. Because plants breathe in carbon dioxide to perform photosynthesis, right?
Yeah.
They turn that gas into solid carbon sugars to build their bodies.
Okay, that makes sense.
So Simard wanted to track exactly where those sugars went after the plant manufactured them.
So she takes a syringe and injects carbon-14, which is a radioactive isotope, into the bag covering the paper birch. Then she takes a different stable isotope, carbon-13, and injects it into the bag covering the Douglas fir.
And then she just waits.
Yeah, she waits for a few hours while the sun shines, allowing both trees to photosynthesize their respective custom-tagged carbon gases. Then she removes the bags, takes out a Geiger counter to measure the radioactive beta decay of the carbon-14, and later uses a mass spectrometer to measure the carbon-13.
She is basically looking at the receipts to see who transferred funds to whom.
That's a perfect way to put it. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because the results she published shattered the foundational dogma of modern forestry.
Completely dismantled it.
She generated undeniable, measurable proof that the paper birch and the Douglas fir were actively trading carbon back and forth beneath the soil.
Two distinct species.
Completely unrelated, locked in what was supposed to be a mortal combat for resources, and they were sharing food.
It's mind-blowing.
Help me understand the mechanics here, though, because it wasn't just a random, passive leaking of resources into the mud, right?
No, not at all. It was directional, and it was seasonal.
Okay, walk me through that.
So, when the tall paper birch was fully leafed out in the summer, it naturally shaded the smaller Douglas fir.
Because it's a broadleaf tree, it has big leaves.
Right. And because the fir was in the shade, it couldn't photosynthesize enough food to survive. So the birch pumped its own excess radioactive carbon-14 down its trunk, out into its roots, and transferred it directly into the roots of the Douglas fir to keep the smaller tree alive.
The birch was basically paying the fir's rent during the summer.
That's exactly what it was doing. But the reciprocity is what makes it a true system.
What happens in the winter?
Well, in the autumn, the paper birch loses its leaves. It goes dormant and can no longer manufacture sugars. But the Douglas fir is an evergreen. It still has its needles.
So it can still photosynthesize.
Exactly. So during the winter, the Douglas fir reverses the flow. It sends its tagged carbon-13 back into the soil and over to the dormant birch tree.
That is just, it's a perfect symbiotic loop. But the conduit for this exchange is the critical piece of the puzzle. They aren't just mashing their roots together, are they?
No, they're not. The physical highway facilitating this massive carbon trade is a vast, microscopic network of mycorrhizal fungi.
Mycorrhizal fungi.
Yes. These are specialized fungi that colonize the root tips of the trees. It is a symbiotic relationship.
Between the tree and the fungus.
Right. The trees manufacture carbon sugars from the sunlight, which the fungi cannot do because they live in the dark under the dirt.
Makes sense.
So the trees feed the fungi. In exchange, the fungi send incredibly fine microscopic threads called hyphae miles through the dense soil.
Wait, miles?
Literally miles of threads. They act like a massive mining operation, dissolving rocks to extract water, phosphorus, and nitrogen, and delivering those minerals back to the tree roots.
So it's a trade. But Simard's breakthrough was proving that these fungal threads didn't just hook up to one single host tree.
That was the game changer.
A single fungal network could colonize the roots of a birch and travel a few feet over and colonize the roots of a fir. The fungi acted as a living bridge, connecting the entire forest floor into a continuous subterranean web.
When she published this data in 1997, it landed on the cover of the prestigious journal Nature.
The cover of Nature, that's huge.
It's as big as it gets.
Yeah.
And the journal actually coined the phrase, the Wood Wide Web.
The Wood Wide Web, I love that.
It is hard to overstate the cultural magnitude of this moment. A young female scientist working in the trenches of the Forest Service produced empirical data that fractured the deeply entrenched, highly masculine lens of pure dominance that had dictated forestry management for a century.
She introduced a scientific framework of collaboration.
Exactly.
It's an incredible triumph. But, a discovery that radically disrupts a multi-billion-dollar industrial extraction method doesn't just quietly enter the textbooks.
No, it generates an earthquake.
And that brings us to the fame, the metaphors, and the absolute scientific firestorm that eventually caught up with her.
Because when science transitions into the public consciousness, it usually requires a translator. And Simard proved to be a masterful communicator.
She really did. In 2016, she delivered a TED Talk titled How Trees Talk to Each Other.
I've seen that one, yeah.
It became a global phenomenon. It racked up over 10 million views.
Yeah.
And then she followed that up with her 2021 memoir, Finding the Mother Tree, which dominated bestseller lists.
Her cultural footprint became massive. Richard Powers heavily based a central character in his Pulitzer-winning novel, The Overstory, on her life and research.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And James Cameron has publicly stated that the globally connected planetary network in the movie Avatar drew direct inspiration from her concepts.
That is wild. The Tree of Souls and Avatar is basically her research.
Exactly. And she achieved this by taking incredibly dense, almost impenetrable field data about isotope decay rates, mass spectrometry, and mycorrhizal root colonization, and distilling it into a concept the general public could instinctively grasp.
The Mother Tree.
Right. She popularized the term the mother tree. She explained that the oldest, most massive trees in a forest stand aren't simply hoarding resources. Because they have the deepest root systems and the most extensive fungal connections, they act as the central nervous system of the stand.
So they're like the hubs.
They function like elders, actively shuttling water and carbon to the younger, more vulnerable saplings growing in the shaded understory.
It is a deeply resonant image. It validates that intuitive, almost spiritual feeling many people experience when they walk into an ancient grove of trees.
It feels right.
It does. But in the hyper-competitive, rigorously skeptical world of academic science, profound popularity often paints a massive target on your back.
The scrutiny amplifies.
And in 2023, a highly organized academic backlash arrived.
It was a very significant moment of scientific friction. A cohort of forest ecologists, most notably Justine Karst, Nils Henriksen, and Jason Robinson, published a series of scathing, peer-reviewed critiques.
And they didn't just nitpick her margins of error, did they?
No, they aimed at the absolute foundation of the Wood Wide Web narrative.
Let's break down their exact methodology and their accusations, because presenting this objectively is crucial. What exactly did these critics claim she was getting wrong?
Their critique focused on several distinct pillars. First, they argued there was a severe lack of verified field evidence.
Lack of field evidence, but she did the isotope stuff in the field.
True, but they claimed that while the fungal networks definitely exist, the idea that they are the primary pathway for these resource transfers in a wild, unmanaged forest was overstated.
I see.
They argued Simard was ignoring alternative pathways. For instance, carbon simply leaking from a root into the soil dirt, floating through the water table, and being passively absorbed by a neighboring plant without the fungus acting as a directed conduit.
Okay, that makes sense as a scientific variable to control for.
Exactly. Secondly, they accused the broader ecological field of something called positive citation bias.
What does that mean?
They conducted a massive literature review and claimed that for 2 decades, scientists were simply citing Simard's original 1997 Nature paper as established gospel without actually conducting new, rigorous field experiments to independently verify her claims.
So they were basically just repeating her findings without testing them again.
That's what the critics argued. They said the scientific community built a towering castle on a single, aging foundation.
Wow. And the third critique, which seems to be the most culturally explosive, was aimed directly at her vocabulary.
Yes, the anthropomorphism.
They aggressively called out her use of anthropomorphism. They argued that applying human concepts, words like mother, altruism, sharing, or communication, to describe blind biological and chemical processes is actively dangerous to the integrity of objective science.
That's a very traditional view of biology.
Right. They posited that trees are ultimately biological machines driven by genetic programming to survive. Projecting human family dynamics onto a fungus clouds the reality of competition.
The real-world fallout from these papers was intense. This wasn't confined to polite debate at a symposium.
No, it got ugly. Simard's University received letters accusing her of lacking scientific integrity. People contacted media outlets demanding retractions of profiles written about her. It became incredibly personal.
That's devastating.
The sources note that Simard's initial reaction was to withdraw. She stopped doing press. She turned her camera off during Zoom meetings. I mean, having your entire life's work publicly dismantled by your peers is a profound psychological blow.
It forces a massive stress test of the scientific method itself, which, is exactly what the process is designed to do.
Right. Looking at the critics' arguments objectively, they raise a valid philosophical red flag. Is it actually detrimental to scientific clarity to use a term like mother tree? Does wrapping a chemical transfer in a warm maternal metaphor blind us to the harsh realities of evolutionary biology?
That tension is the absolute core of Simard's 2025 rebuttal, published in Frontiers in Forests and Global Change. And when you analyze her defense, she doesn't just argue philosophy, she brings receipts.
Oh, I love that. What did she find?
She meticulously addressed the methodological flaws in the critics' review. Let's take the accusation of positive citation bias.
Okay.
Simard and her co-authors demonstrated that Karst and her team used a highly questionable statistical model.
How so?
The critics artificially inflated the appearance of bias by automatically treating every single year since a paper's publication as a compounding mathematical factor of bias.
Wait, so just because a paper is older, their math made it look more biased?
Exactly. It heavily skewed the results against older foundational papers.
So the math behind the critique was essentially rigged to make older papers look inherently biased just for existing for a long time.
That was her argument. Furthermore, Simard pointed out a massive exclusion in the critics' dataset.
What did they leave out?
The critics explicitly threw out any data derived from greenhouse studies or controlled laboratory experiments. They insisted that only pure wild field data was admissible to prove the fungal network's function.
But logically, trying to isolate a single variable like whether a carbon molecule traveled through a fungal tube or just floated through the mud is nearly impossible in a wild forest where it is raining, animals are digging, and a million microbes are interacting simultaneously.
It's chaos out there.
Right. You would have to use controlled greenhouse studies to physically verify the exact mechanism, wouldn't you?
Precisely. Simard argued that the critics artificially narrowed the scope of what constituted evidence to fit a predetermined narrative of doubt.
Wow.
But beyond the statistical fistfight, this conflict illuminated a massive rift in the epistemology of science.
Epistemology.
It's simply the study of how we know what we know, what constitutes valid knowledge.
So the critics are arguing for strict reductionism.
Exactly. Reductionism dictates that to understand a system, you must break it down into its smallest possible isolated parts and observe them in a vacuum.
Like studying a single cog to understand a clock.
Right. But Simard argued that strict reductionism completely fails when applied to ecology. If you break a forest down and only study a single tree root in a sterile plastic pot, you will fundamentally miss the emergent phenomena of the entire interconnected network.
A forest is greater than the sum of its isolated parts.
Exactly.
And regarding the accusation of anthropomorphism, she vigorously defended her language. She brought in sociological and psychological data showing that communicating science using relatable narrative concepts actually leads to significantly higher rates of public engagement and real-world conservation funding.
Which is a huge point.
It is. If the voting public views a forest merely as a board-foot timber resource competing for light, they don't care if it's clear-cut. But if they understand it as a community of mother trees supporting a complex web of life, they will literally chain themselves to the bulldozers to protect it.
It is a profound debate. On one side, the demand for cold, mechanistic, perfectly isolated objectivity. On the other, the argument that holistic, systems-level understanding requires a language of connection.
And while the academic debate will undoubtedly rage on for decades, what Simard chose to do next is what makes her story so compelling.
She didn't retreat into theory.
No, she went back out into the dirt. She launched the Mother Tree Project, which is arguably one of the most ambitious landscape-scale forestry experiments ever conducted in North America.
The logistics of the Mother Tree Project are genuinely staggering to think about. It is not an experiment in a greenhouse.
No, it's massive.
They established testing sites across a massive 900-kilometer climate gradient. They're operating in 9 distinct wild forests across British Columbia.
9 whole forests.
Yeah, and the goal is to physically test different methods of industrial logging to see what actually happens to the ecosystem. They are clear-cutting some sections, and in others they're practicing retention logging.
Which means leaving trees behind.
Right, leaving behind 10%, 30%, or 60% of the oldest, largest mother trees to see how the network responds.
But as she scaled up this massive empirical experiment, a crucial paradigm shift occurred. She realized that the Western reductionist toolkit she was trained in was insufficient to fully comprehend the complexity of the landscape.
So she looked elsewhere.
Yeah, she began actively bridging the gap between Western empirical science and traditional ecological knowledge.
This collaboration is where the narrative of when the forest breathes expands beautifully. Simard partnered with Dr. Teresa Ryan.
Right.
She's a brilliant fisheries scientist from the Tsimshian Nation, whose traditional name is Heliox. And through this partnership, Simard realized that her grand revolutionary discoveries about fungal networks and interconnectedness were not actually new discoveries at all.
They were just new to Western science.
Exactly. They perfectly aligned with indigenous knowledge systems that had been deeply understood and actively utilized for ecosystem management for thousands of years.
The Western concept of the wild, untouched, virgin wilderness is largely a colonial myth.
Very much so.
Yeah.
These landscapes were meticulously and sustainably shaped by human stewardship long before industrial logging arrived.
The example Dr. Ryan provided regarding the salmon is just extraordinary. It perfectly illustrates how these systems are linked. Indigenous communities have managed salmon fisheries in strict accordance with tidal cycles and seasonal runs for generations to ensure perpetual abundance.
Right.
But what Western science is only just now developing the tools to physically track is how the life cycle of that salmon is physically injected into the canopy of the forest.
The mechanics of this nutrient transfer are a masterclass in ecosystem engineering.
Walk us through the physical journey of that salmon, because this blew my mind.
Okay, so the salmon spend their adult lives accumulating rich nutrients, specifically nitrogen, in the deep ocean. When they return to the freshwater rivers to spawn, they bring the ocean with them. Predators like grizzly bears, eagles, and wolves catch the migrating salmon and drag the carcasses deep into the forest underbrush to consume them safely.
Away from the river.
Right, and they leave the scraps behind.
Just rotting fish on the forest floor.
Exactly. The decaying fish are rapidly colonized by maggots, insects, and soil microbes, which break the physical flesh down into liquid nutrients. Now, the critical marker here is the nitrogen.
Right, the tracking tag.
Yeah. Ocean nitrogen contains a high concentration of the heavier nitrogen-15 isotope, which is distinct from the lighter nitrogen-14 found naturally in the terrestrial atmosphere.
It's a natural tracking tag.
Precisely. Samar's team, working alongside indigenous researchers, tested the soils and the trees. And they found that the mycorrhizal fungi, the wood wide web, were aggressively absorbing this marine nitrogen-15 from the decaying salmon and shuttling it directly into the roots of the surrounding trees. By testing the core samples of the timber, they found high concentrations of deep ocean nitrogen locked in the highest needles of the oldest ancient cedars and firs.
That is insane.
The trees are physically constructed out of the ocean.
It completely validates the indigenous worldview. You cannot manage the timber resource without managing the salmon run, the bear population, and the soil fungi. It is a single, continuous, breathing entity.
Everything is connected.
And this profound understanding of biological connection paved the way for perhaps the most astonishing discovery to emerge from Simard's laboratory.
This involves the groundbreaking work of Amanda Assay.
Yes, her graduate student.
Right, a brilliant graduate student under Simard's mentorship. Assay spent years meticulously designing complex experiments to test the limits of fungal communication. And she provided empirical evidence for a concept that borders on science fiction.
What did she find?
She proved that Douglas fir trees possess the ability to recognize their own genetic kin.
Wait, how does a stationary block of wood recognize its offspring in the pitch black of the soil? I mean, what is the physical mechanism?
It happens through complex biochemistry. Plant roots are not just passive straws sucking up water. They are highly active membranes that constantly weep chemical cocktails into the soil.
They're weeping chemicals.
Yeah, these are called root exudates. They consist of specific volatile organic compounds, flavonoids, and distinct sugars. It acts as a unique chemical fingerprint.
So the mother tree is constantly leaking this chemical signature.
Yes, and the vast fungal network surrounding the roots acts as a receptor grid. When a seed falls from a mother tree and germinates nearby, its tiny roots begin leaking a nearly identical genetic chemical signature.
Oh, wow.
The mother tree detects this specific exudate through the fungal network. Assay's research proved that once the mother tree recognizes its own kin, it actively alters its behavior.
How so?
It manipulates the fungal pathways to funnel a significantly higher volume of carbon and nutrients to its own offspring compared to a stranger seed from a different tree growing right next to it.
It is showing biological favoritism.
It goes beyond just food, actually.
Really?
Yeah. If the mother tree is physically attacked, say, by a swarm of spruce budworms eating its needles, it will immediately synthesize defensive chemicals like jasmonic acid and pump those warning signals down through the fungal network, specifically targeting its kin.
Warning its kids.
Exactly. The young saplings receive the signal and preemptively ramp up their own chemical defenses before the bugs even reach them.
We are talking about trees identifying their children, feeding them preferentially, and warning them of impending danger. It is breathtaking biology.
It really is.
And this is exactly the point in When the Forest Breathes, where the narrative seamlessly transitions from a dense scientific text into a profoundly moving exploration of the human condition.
Because it gets very personal.
It does, because while Simard and her lab are mapping these incredible networks of kinship, care, and legacy beneath the soil, Simard's own personal life is being fractured by intense loss.
The biographical chapters of the book document a truly harrowing decade for her. In 2012, Simard was diagnosed with a severe form of breast cancer.
She wrote a lot of her first book during that, didn't she?
She wrote the majority of her first book while enduring grueling chemotherapy treatments. She was drawing a very literal sense of strength and perspective from her understanding of the forest's immense resilience.
But the tragedies compounded rapidly. The loss of Amanda Assay is absolutely devastating to read.
In 2022, Amanda Assay, the very student who spent her life proving that trees recognize and protect their kin, was killed in a tragic backcountry skiing accident at the age of 33.
It's just heartbreaking.
It was an unfathomable loss for the scientific community and deeply traumatic for Simard, who viewed Amanda as a protege and a part of her academic family.
And then, just months later, Simard's own mother, who was suffering from steep physical decline, elected to undergo a medically assisted death.
It's a lot of loss all at once.
You read these sequences, and the sheer volume of grief is palpable. Her daughters are growing up and moving away. Her brilliant protege is suddenly gone. Her mother passes. The canopy of her life is rapidly opening up.
That's a beautiful way to phrase it.
But the brilliance of her writing is how she uses her own scientific discoveries to process this grief. She didn't retreat into despair, She looked to the biology of the mother trees to understand mortality.
If we look closely at the data regarding how a forest handles death, we see the exact mechanisms that brought her comfort.
Tell me about that process.
In the course of her research, Simard meticulously tracked what happens when a massive mother tree reaches the end of its life, whether it is dying slowly from old age, a bark beetle infestation, or drought stress. The tree does not simply shut down and quietly fade away.
It doesn't hoard its remaining energy.
Exactly the opposite. As the tree enters senescence, the biological process of aging and dying, it actively accelerates its internal machinery.
It speeds up.
Yes. It begins breaking down its own chlorophyll and dismantling its cellular structures. And then, in a massive final act, it forcefully shunts its remaining carbon reserves, its accumulated water, and its library of chemical defense signals down into its root system.
Pushing it all out.
It pushes all of its accumulated wealth into the fungal network, distributing it directly to the younger saplings surrounding it.
Death in the ecosystem is not a termination. It is a highly organized, vital transfer of energy. The old tree literally empties itself out to physically construct the next generation.
It ensures the survival of the wider community.
And Simard draws this beautiful, heartbreaking parallel. She realizes that her mother's passing, or the massive legacy of Amanda's research left behind, are the human expressions of this biological process.
They passed it on.
They pass their wisdom, their love, and their scientific breakthroughs into the network of the people surviving them. The older canopy falls, which allows the sunlight to finally reach the forest floor, nurturing the new growth that has been fortified by their roots.
It is a scientific framework for processing mortality. It's incredibly moving.
It really is. But this profound understanding of a forest as a highly connected, actively grieving, and regenerating community brings us to a massive existential crisis.
The climate crisis.
Exactly. If this is how a forest actually functions, how do we fundamentally change our industrial behavior to stop destroying it? How do we utilize this science to help these ecosystems survive the absolute onslaught of the global climate crisis?
This brings us back to the hard data produced by the 900-kilometer Mother Tree Project and how it directly impacts public policy.
Because the industry had an excuse.
Oh, yes. For decades, the industrial logging lobby defended clear-cutting by claiming it was essentially just a mechanical mimicry of a natural disturbance, like a large wildfire.
They argued the forest naturally bounces back from a fire, so it will bounce back from a clear cut.
That was the party line. But the empirical data proved that to be entirely false.
Because the mechanism of destruction is completely different.
Completely different. When a forest burns naturally, the dead trees remain standing. The root systems, while damaged, remain in the soil. The structural architecture of the ground is intact, and the fungal network can survive deep underground to jumpstart regeneration.
But when you clear cut, you bring in massive, multi-ton feller buncher machines with massive treads.
Exactly. The sheer physical weight of the industrial machinery severely compacts the dirt, literally crushing the microscopic fungal hyphae. It destroys the subterranean architecture.
And the Mother Tree Project quantified the catastrophic result of this destruction. Clear cutting unleashes a massive, invisible carbon bomb.
It's terrifying when you look at the numbers.
Explain the mechanics of the carbon bomb, because people assume the carbon is just in the wood that gets driven away on the logging truck.
Right, that's a common misconception.
Yeah.
The majority of a forest's sequestered carbon is not actually held in the visible tree trunks.
Where is it?
It is locked deep in the soil profile, bound within the fungal webs, the root structures, and the decaying organic matter. When you clear-cut, crush the soil, and expose it to direct, harsh sunlight, the soil temperature spikes.
It literally bakes the ground.
Yes. This rapid heating causes the microbial life to aggressively break down the stored organic matter, which rapidly off-gasses thousands of tons of stored carbon dioxide directly back into the atmosphere.
So industrial logging is a massive, often uncounted accelerator of global warming.
Hugely. Furthermore, when they plant those new isolated seedlings into that crushed, sterile dirt, without the mother trees to provide shade and without the fungal network to provide water, the seedlings are incredibly vulnerable to drought and disease.
But the data from the retention logging sites offered a highly viable alternative.
Which is the hope in all this.
The experiments prove that if you log selectively, leaving the oldest, largest mother trees and patches of intact forest untouched, the outcome is radically different.
The structural integrity of the soil is maintained. The fungal network survives.
And most importantly, the forest maintains its carbon sink. It continues to hold on to its sequestered carbon instead of vomiting it into the atmosphere.
And preserving that intact fungal network is absolutely paramount for the next massive ecological hurdle we are facing, which is climate migration.
This is a fascinating concept. Define exactly what a climate envelope is and why it's moving.
A climate envelope is the highly specific range of environmental conditions, the exact mean temperature, the annual rainfall, the soil acidity that a particular species of plant requires to survive.
Okay.
But because of rapidly accelerating global warming, these climate envelopes are physically shifting northward and higher up the elevations of the mountains at a rate of several kilometers per year.
The weather a tree needs to survive is literally outrunning the tree.
Precisely. A mature tree obviously cannot pull up its roots and walk north, and they cannot drop their seeds far enough or fast enough to keep pace with the shifting temperature bands.
So they are trapped in a climate that is becoming increasingly hostile to their genetics.
Yes. And to prevent massive die-offs, scientists and foresters are stepping in with an innovative, somewhat controversial practice called assisted migration.
This means humans are physically intervening. They are collecting seeds from warmer southern climates, germinating them, and manually planting the seedlings hundreds of miles further north.
They're trying to anticipate what the climate in that northern region will actually look like in 50 to 100 years.
But the critical revelation from Simard's team is discovering exactly how these climate migrant seedlings manage to survive in a foreign environment.
Right, because if you take a seedling adapted to a warmer southern climate and plant it in the middle of a barren, scorched clear-cut of the north, the environmental shock is usually fatal.
They succumb to unpredictable frosts or sudden droughts.
Exactly. But if they plant that exact same climate migrant seedling into an intact old-growth forest directly into the established fungal network maintained by ancient mother trees, the survival rate of the migrants absolutely skyrockets.
The established ecosystem adopts the migrants.
Yes. The massive root systems of the old trees act as physical anchors, regulating the soil moisture and temperature. And because the fungi don't care about the species of the tree, they plug the new seedlings directly into the nutrient grid.
They share water and buffer them against the extremes of their new environment until they can establish themselves. It is a stunning, naturally occurring mechanism for climate resilience.
It really is.
But I have to ask the obvious question here. If the empirical data is this clear, if clear-cutting detonates a massive carbon bomb, destroys the water retention of the soil, and actively kills the new seedlings, while retention logging preserves the carbon sink and helps the entire ecosystem adapt to global warming, what is the justification from the industrial sector?
Money.
I mean, why are conglomerates still clear-cutting and spraying herbicides?
It ultimately comes down to a brutal clash of economic timelines and fundamental worldviews.
Explain that.
The industrial forestry complex, as it is currently legally and financially structured, operates on a mandate of short-term profit maximization. It is an extractive commodity industry governed by quarterly earnings expectations and shareholder dividends.
So it's just about the next 3 months?
Exactly. Utilizing massive machinery to clear-cut a mountainside is simply the cheapest, fastest way to extract the maximum volume of board feed with the absolute minimum cost of human labor.
It is an economy of scale designed to ignore the ecological externalities.
Yes. Conversely, the regenerative forestry model that Simard and indigenous leaders advocate for operates on a timeline of centuries.
Right.
It's a model of reciprocity. Implementing retention logging requires significantly more specialized human labor. It requires trained foresters physically walking the land, analyzing the topography, and making complex, localized decisions about which specific trees to harvest and which to protect.
It demands extracting less volume today to guarantee the forest remains a viable, functioning ecosystem a century from now.
And that kind of long-term ecological investment simply does not fit neatly into a corporate quarterly profit spreadsheet.
And it is exactly this frustration, the yawning chasm between the overwhelming, peer-reviewed scientific evidence she spent her life gathering and the stubborn, destructive reality of ongoing industrial practice that eventually pushed Simard to drastically alter her approach.
She had to change tactics.
She stepped out of the laboratory and directly onto the front lines of environmental activism.
In 2021 on Vancouver Island, a massive conflict erupted at Fairy Creek. Activists established blockades to prevent logging conglomerates from clear-cutting some of the very last ancient old-growth watersheds left in the province.
And Suzanne Simard traveled to the blockades and was physically arrested by the authorities.
Sue-wise.
To be clear, we are reporting on her actions objectively here. We aren't taking a stance on the politics or legality of the logging protests, but analyzing her actions through the lens of her career is fascinating.
It demonstrates a profound philosophical evolution for a scientist.
It does. She reached a point where publishing meticulously researched papers in Nature was no longer sufficient. She genuinely believed that when the fundamental life support systems of the planet are being actively dismantled, a scientist has a moral obligation to step off the academic page and put their body in the way of the machinery.
And true to her nature as an educator, the report states she utilized the moment of her arrest to literally lecture the detaining police officers on the specific carbon sequestration rates of the ancient cedar canopy they were standing under.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Excuse me, officer, before you put the zip ties on, we need to discuss the isotopic transfer of nitrogen in this specific watershed.
It is a remarkable testament to her absolute dedication to the data.
It really is. To synthesize the immense ground we have covered today, we have traced a truly monumental arc of scientific discovery. We began with a solitary young woman in a logging camp, looking at sickly seedlings in a sterilized plantation, trusting her intuition that a vital, unseen component was missing from the equation.
We examined the rigorous, physically demanding radioactive isotope experiments that sparked a global paradigm shift, proving empirically that a forest is not a collection of isolated competitors, but a deeply connected, communicative biological web.
We analyzed the intense crucible of academic blowback, exploring the philosophical divide between strict reductionism and complex systems theory, where the very language used to describe biology was put on trial.
We walked through profound personal grief, witnessing how the biological transfer of energy in a dying tree provided a framework for understanding human mortality and legacy.
And finally, we looked at how this massive body of research provides a tangible, mathematically verified blueprint for survival. It offers a method of forestry that respects the microscopic architecture of the soil, honors the deep history of indigenous stewardship, and actively engineers our landscapes to withstand the accelerating pressures of a warming world.
It serves as a powerful reminder that science is not merely a sterile collection of data points. It is a deeply human endeavor, driven by intense curiosity, resilience in the face of institutional pushback, and a fundamental desire to understand our precise place within the broader web of life.
If you want to truly experience the depth of the narrative, the rigorous mechanics of the science, and the profound emotional weight of this decades-long journey, you really need to read the source material directly.
Absolutely.
When the Forest Breathes by Suzanne Simard is available right now at your favorite bookseller, it is a perspective-altering work.
Thank you for joining us as we unpacked this incredible research.
We want to leave you with one final, provocative concept to mull over on your own, something that builds on everything we've discussed today but pushes it into an entirely new realm.
What is it?
Well, we have spent an hour establishing that forests are demonstrably interconnected communities. They share resources, they recognize their kin, they communicate danger, and they actively manage their ecosystems for future generations. If science can empirically prove that a forest functions as a highly complex, self-regulating entity, does that entity deserve legal personhood?
Oh, wow. That's a huge question.
We currently grant the legal rights of personhood to artificial constructs like massive corporations, allowing them to sue for damages and protect their interests in a court of law. If a fungal network is actively making decisions to distribute wealth and protect its community, should that ancient living network have legal standing to sue the logging company trying to pave over it?
It completely flips our legal framework.
As our scientific understanding of biological intelligence expands, how long until our legal and ethical frameworks are forced to expand with it? Think about that the next time you step off the pavement and onto the soil. Until next time.
Heliox is produced by Michelle Brucker and Scott Bleakley. It features reviews of emerging research and ideas from leading thinkers, curated under their creative direction with AI assistance for voice, imagery, and composition. Systemic voices and illustrative images of people are representative tools, not depictions of specific individuals. Thanks for listening today. 4 recurring narratives underlie every episode: boundary dissolution, adaptive complexity, embodied knowledge, and quantum-like uncertainty. These aren't just philosophical musings, but frameworks for understanding our modern world. We hope you continue exploring our other episodes, responding to the content, and checking out our related articles at helioxpodcast.substack.com.